Welcome to a deep dive into something you might think you already understand replication.
Mm.
But we're going way beyond just like the usual DNA stuff to explore how this idea really shapes what survives and thrives, from genes to like catchy tunes even.
Exactly. We're kind of taking a philosopher's lens to this whole thing.
Yeah.
So our main source here is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on replication and reproduction. So get ready to do some serious conceptual unpacking.
Okay, so this isn't just like cells splitting. Where did this whole replication idea even come from?
Well, it really kind of gained traction after World War II, alongside all these breakthroughs that were happening in fields like information theory. So think about it like the structure of DNA, that double helix. It's like a blueprint being copied, right?
Yeah, I mean, that iconic image we all know really kind of solidified that whole DNA as code thing.
Exactly, and that led to, the central dogma of molecular biology. DNA determines the sequence of amino acids, which builds proteins and so on. It's kind of life seen through this informational lens.
And then comes Richard Dawkins, right? His book, The Selfish Gene, kind of took this idea and ran with it.
Yeah, he argued that replicators are this driving force of evolution, with genes being just one example. He even coined the term meme for these cultural replicators. Ideas, behaviors, anything that spreads like a catchy song.
So that earworm I can't get out of my head, that's evolution in action. Seriously.
In a way, yes. It really highlights how the principles of replication can apply beyond biology. But it's not a simple, copy-paste situation. Philosopher David Hall argued that we need to think about these interactors, not just these passive vehicles.
Interactor. So like organisms aren't just along for the ride.
Right. Think about a beaver's dam. It's obviously influenced by genes, but then it also shapes the environment, which then affects the survival of those genes. It's what's called an extended phenotype, part of the replicator's success story.
Whoa. So the dam is like an extension of the beaver's ability to replicate its genes. That's a whole new way of looking at things.
Precisely. And it really challenges the idea that genes are the only actors here. What about things like the immune system, which evolves within your lifetime, but isn't passed down through DNA?
Yeah, that makes sense. But if we're going beyond genes, what even makes something a replicator? Does it need to be perfectly copied like DNA?
That's where some philosophers start to push back against Dawkins. They argue that what really matters is this thing called heritability, even if things aren't copied exactly, As long as the offspring are somewhat similar to their parents, evolution can still work.
Okay, so slight variations are okay, but then could replicators themselves have evolved from things that didn't replicate perfectly?
That's a fascinating question. And it leads us to this concept of reproducers. It's not just about the copying, but the whole cycle of development and procreation. So how did those processes themselves even come about? And that idea of reproducers really kind of challenges us to think about evolution differently. It's not just about what gets copied, but like the whole process of development and how that gets repeated across generations.
So instead of focusing on the blueprint, we're looking at like the entire construction project from start to finish.
Exactly. And this is where some of these alternative theories come into play. One of the most interesting is developmental systems theory, or DST.
Okay, I've heard of DST, but to be honest, it always seemed a bit dense. How does it fit into this whole replication conversation?
Well, DST argues that genes aren't the only players in this whole inheritance game. Instead, it emphasizes the whole developmental system. The genes, the organism, the environment, everything.
So it was like a complex recipe, where the ingredients and the steps mattered just as much as the final dish.
That's a great analogy. DST says that information isn't just encoded in the DNA, it's actually distributed throughout the entire system. So the unit of selection isn't just the gene, but the whole developmental process.
That's a pretty radical shift from that selfish gene perspective. But we're not just focusing on genes. How does DST explain how traits get passed down?
It's not about copying these specific bits of information, but about recreating a developmental process across generations. Think of it like a bird building a nest, The specific twigs might change. But the process of nest building, which is influenced by genes, environment, and learning, is what gets repeated.
So even if a trait isn't directly encoded in DNA, it could still be inherited if it's part of this repeating developmental cycle.
Right, and that brings us to the idea of extended replicators, things like bird nests or beaver gems. Philosopher Kim Sterelny argued that these structures, though not made of DNA, can still act as replicators because they contribute to that cycle of development and survival.
So it's not just genes being copied, but these larger patterns of interaction between organisms and their environment.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, does evolution always require replication in any form? Philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith argues that we need to kind of distinguish between the replicator-interactor framework and the classical view of evolution.
Okay, I'm all ears. Break down that distinction for me.
So the classical view focuses on variation, heritability, and differences in fitness. It doesn't actually require perfect replication. As long as offspring are somewhat similar to their parents, natural selection can act.
So even if the copying isn't perfect, evolution can still happen as long as there's some resemblance between generations.
Precisely, the key difference is that the replicator framework emphasizes the things being copied. While the classical view focuses on changes in the population over time, it's a subtle but important shift in perspective.
So it's like zooming out from individual genes to
Yeah.
see the bigger picture of how populations change over time.
Exactly, and this raises the question, could replicators themselves have evolved from simpler things that didn't replicate perfectly? Imagine a world before replicators as we know them, where selection was based purely on which entities persisted longer.
A world without replicators, that's a mind-bending thought. But how could evolution even work in such a world?
Well, Godfrey Smith suggests that even without replication, you could still have selection based on this differential persistence. The more stable or long-lasting entities would become more common, simply by surviving longer.
It's like a slow and steady race where durability is the key to winning.
Exactly. And over time, this could lead to the emergence of more complex forms of inheritance, eventually giving rise to the replicators we know today.
So instead of being the starting point, replicators might be a product of evolution themselves that completely flips the script.
It does, and it really highlights how much we still have to learn about this intricate dance between replication and evolution. But before we get too carried away,
Hmm.
let's kind of step back and consider a few more wrinkles in this already complex story.
All right, so we've gone from genes as replicators to the entire developmental system as a replicator.
Mm.
Are we ready to say case closed? We've solved evolution.
Not quite. There's another layer to this. Remember how we were talking about reproducers focusing on that whole cycle of development and procreation? Well, some people argue that even that might be too limited.
Okay, now I'm really curious what could be broader than the entire life cycle of an organism.
Okay, so think about this. Some traits or structures might reappear in a population even if they weren't directly inherited from a parent. They could arise through similar developmental processes or environmental pressures.
So like two species developing similar features because they live in similar environments,
Yeah.
even though they aren't closely related, convergent evolution.
That's a good example, but this goes even deeper. It's called the reconstitutor concept. It's not just about tracing a trait back to a specific ancestor, but recognizing that similar traits can emerge independently through shared developmental pathways or environmental influences.
So instead of just looking at the family tree, we're looking at the entire forest and how different trees might grow in similar ways.
Precisely, the reconstitutor concept kind of suggests that the entire evolutionary context, development, environment interactions, all of it shapes the patterns that we see in nature.
That's a huge shift.
Right.
But if we're not focusing on these direct lines of inheritance, how do we even study evolution? It seems like we're losing all sense of structure.
It definitely adds complexity. There's a lot of debate about whether the reconstitutor concept is truly useful or if it just muddies the waters.
Hmm.
Some argue that it makes it hard to distinguish between different kinds of evolutionary change, like selection versus random mutation.
So it's like adding too many ingredients to our evolutionary recipe. We might get something interesting, but it's hard to tell what each component contributes.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. How do we capture the complexity of evolution without oversimplifying or overcomplicating things? That's an ongoing challenge for evolutionary theory.
It's certainly given me a lot to think about. So after this deep dive, what are the big takeaways about replication and its role in evolution?
Well, firstly, the concept of replication itself has evolved. We've moved beyond just genes being copied to consider memes, extended phenotypes, even entire developmental systems as potential replicators.
Our understanding of replication has gone through its own evolution, hasn't it? We've gone
Mhm.
from a simple copy and paste view to a much more nuanced and interconnected understanding.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most important takeaway is that the question of whether replication is essential to evolution remains open. We've seen strong arguments on both sides. Genes and the replication are clearly crucial. But we've also seen how other mechanisms like DST and the reconstitutor concept suggest that evolution can work through these broader processes.
It seems like our simple black and white picture of evolution has become a much more complex and nuanced landscape.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. There's so much more to explore. Evolutionary theory is constantly developing and being challenged, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
It's definitely challenged some of my assumptions. So for our listeners, here's a final thought to ponder. What if we shift our focus from replication to recurrence? How does thinking about recurring patterns in nature, from snowflakes to organisms to ideas, change our understanding of evolution? That's a question worth exploring on your own. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with Keep Those Brains Buzzing.